where yesterday sat quietly beside today, the quiet chair by the window. I remembered the first night after the war ended, as if it were still pressed gently into the folds of my memory. Not as a sharp wound, but as a soft echo that lingers in the ear long after the sound has gone. The world around me seemed different, yet eerily the same. The chair by the window where I sit tonight is the same chair where I once polished my boots, counting the seconds before I would be called back to the field. Today, it simply holds my weight in the shadows of yesterday, both refusing to move. The window before me does not know the difference between then and now. It frames the same street, the same cobblestones, the same crooked lantern at the corner that leans as though it too remembers the nights when soldiers walked beneath its faint light. Yesterday sits quietly beside me here. Don't push it away. I've learned that yesterday does not vanish simply because today has arrived, lingers, waiting to be acknowledged, to be held. Sometimes to be forgiven. At night, when the silence grows deep enough, I hear the boots, not marching now, not synchronized, but scattered steps across the wooden floor of my mind. They belong to men I knew, boys I laughed with, brothers I buried without markers. I don't dream of battles anymore. I dream of waiting for letters, waiting for dawn, waiting for the sound that would tell us the world was still intact. Waiting became a second heartbeat in those days. I tell myself these memories are gentle enough now, softened by time. Yet, as I write this, I realize they are only quiet because I have grown used to their noise. Yesterday does not fade. It learns to sit silently, like an old friend who no longer needs to speak to be present. The night the armistice was signed, we were too tired to celebrate. I remember lying in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of a borrowed room, hearing a church bell toll somewhere beyond the hills. It was not ringing for victory, okay? It was ringing because it always rang at that hour, indifferent to the war or its end. That indifference comforted me, reminded me that the world had rhythms deeper than gunfire. Today, as I sit in this chair, I hear no bells, only the creak of the wooden frame as it shifts beneath me. Yet, if I close my eyes, I can hear them still. I wonder sometimes if yesterday insists on returning not to haunt me, but to keep me whole. As though the pieces of my story would collapse if I allowed myself to forget. When I was a boy, long before the war, my father told me that memory was like a garden. You must choose what to water, or weeds will take over. I did not understand him then. Now, I think of that lesson often. My garden holds graves, laughter, hunger, and even the smell of bread shared among comrades on a winter night. Which of these do I water when I allow myself to remember? Perhaps all of them, because each is part of who I became. I am not sure if sleep will come easily tonight. Sometimes it lingers just out of reach, like a soldier unwilling to enter the quiet of his own home. I often wonder if rest itself has grown afraid of me. But telling these memories, allowing yesterday to sit beside today, brings a kind of peace. If I place them carefully, one by one, perhaps they will form a pillow soft enough for dreams. The war was long, but the nights afterward have been longer. What no one tells you is that silence carries a weight heavier than any weapon. In the trenches, every sound was sharp, urgent, alive. Out here, in this chair by the window, the silence swells until it presses against my chest. Still, I choose to sit with it. Yesterday sits beside me, patient, watching, waiting, whispering that it still belongs here. I do not resist. I let yesterday breathe. And in doing so, I realize I am breathing too. There was a letter I carried with me through nearly the entire campaign. It was folded so many times that its edges had become thin as the fragile wings of a moth. Kate. It wasn't from family, nor from a lover, but from a neighbor back home who had written to thank me for carrying the village's hopes with me. She had enclosed a pressed violet, and I kept it even when it crumbled into dust. Sometimes, when the firing ceased, I would take that letter out and smooth it against my knee, pretending that the paper itself held warmth. When the war ended, I placed that letter inside the drawer of this very desk. It is still there, hidden beneath newer papers, but I do not take it out anymore. The violet has vanished into powder, but its ghost lingers in the fibers of the page. Yesterday sits inside that drawer, folded and silent, but alive. My house is filled with these quiet relics. A dented canteen, a photograph blurred by rain, a pair of gloves worn thin from mud. They did not speak, but when I brush against them, they awaken. Each one is a doorway back into the cold mornings, the whispered jokes, the faces pressed against the dark before dawn. Some would say I should pack them away, send them to a museum, or bury them beneath new memories. But I keep them near because they remind me that what I endured was real. Without them, perhaps I would begin to believe it was only a fevered dream. Sleep comes slowly as I trace these objects in my mind. I imagine my comrades' laughter rising like steam from a pot of soup shared on a bitter night. I see the flicker of lanterns along the trench walls. I hear the scratch of pencils on damp paper as men tried to write home before the shelling resumed. The past does not knock its lips in quietly, sits in the chair across from me, and waits. Sometimes I speak aloud to it. I tell yesterday that I am tired, that I cannot carry all of it at once. I tell it that today is frail, and I must let it stand on its own legs without being swallowed by memory. Cried. Yesterday only smiles, patient, unbending. It knows I cannot send it away. It knows it has earned its place. Once, a child from the neighborhood asked me what the war was like. I did not know how to answer. I could have spoken of mud that reached your knees, of hunger that carved hollows in your cheeks, of fear that lived in your throat. But instead, I told her it was like waiting for a letter you weren't sure would ever come, and sometimes receiving nothing but silence. She nodded as if she understood. Perhaps children sense truth more clearly than we do. The war is gone, yet it moves within me like a second shadow. In the evenings, when the sun sets low, I walk to the edge of the street and watch the colors bleed across the sky. There, in the fading light, I sometimes see the outlines of helmets, the slouch of tired shoulders, the shuffle of men moving forward because there was no other choice. I do not call out to them, okay? Let them pass, leaving the silence intact. Tonight, I remain in my chair by the window, letting yesterday lean against my shoulder. Okay. The world outside is calm, the lantern still crooked, the cobblestones damp from rain. Okay. My eyes grow heavy, though my mind stays awake. Sleep will come when it chooses, but for now, I keep company with memory, and if tomorrow arrives as gently as tonight, I will welcome it, not as something separate from yesterday, but as its quiet companion. For yesterday and today are not rivals. They are brothers who share the same room, the march that never stopped. There is a sound that still follows me, though I sit here alone in my house. It is not the sharp crack of rifles, nor the thunder of artillery, nor even the distant cry of men calling for water in the dark. It is the steady rhythm of boots against the earth. It's a sound so constant that it embedded itself deep into my bones. Even now, decades later, when I rise in the night to fetch a glass of water, my feet echo that same cadence across the wooden floorboards. The march never truly ended. It only changed landscapes. Once, it was across muddy fields, through forests, stripped bare by winter and war, over bridges trembling beneath the weight of columns of men. Now, it is from the bed to the window, from the window to the chair, from the chair to the quiet kitchen. But the rhythm always, the rhythm remains. When we first set out, we believed the march would carry us quickly to glory. Young men, shoulders squared, rifles gleaming beneath the sun. We felt taller than we were, as if our boots lifted us above the dust of the road. Mothers waved handkerchiefs, children ran alongside us, and the old men tipped their hats with solemn approval. We were part of a story larger than ourselves, or so we believed. We did not yet know how long that road would stretch, nor how many of us would vanish before reaching its unseen end. The first days were almost joyous. We sang songs we half remembered, our voices swelling into the air as though we could outpace fear with melody. But soon the singing died. The march lengthened. The weight of our packs grew heavier, pressing into our shoulders until our skin broke and bled. Feet blistered, boots filled with mud and water, and still we moved, always forward, always onward. At night, when we stopped, the march continued in our dreams. I remember lying down on damp ground, eyes closed, body desperate for rest, and feeling my legs twitch as if they were still carrying me forward. Some of the men spoke of it too. How their feet ached, even in sleep. How their dreams were filled with endless roads that stretched beyond the horizon. One, Soldier Thomas, I think once, said perhaps this is what eternity is. Walking forward forever, with no arrival. We laughed then, but quietly, 'cause in our hearts we wondered if he was right. Even after battles ended, after the cannons fell silent for a time, we still marched. Sometimes into towns that no longer had roofs, sometimes past fields where nothing grew, sometimes along roads lined with faces that stared at us without words. Their silence was its own kind of wound. Children watched us as though we were already ghosts. Women clutched their shawls tightly. Men tipped their hats, but without pride, only exhaustion. And still our boots struck the earth in unison. The sound of a march is unlike anything else. It is both music and dirge, unity and loneliness combined. In the trenches, one could feel isolated, a single fragile life pressed against the mud. But on the road, in the march, individuality dissolved. We became one body, one set of lungs, one pair of feet multiplied by hundreds. Perhaps that is why the sound remains inside MIT was the closest we ever came to feeling indestructible. Though in truth, we were anything but. Years later, when the war ended, I thought the march would finally rest. I thought silence would return, and the rhythm of boots would fade into memory. But it did not. Even as I stepped out of uniform, even as I walked homeward along the familiar cobblestones of my childhood street, the sound was still there. My neighbors told me they could hear me coming before they saw me, that my steps carried the echo of an army. I tried to walk differently, lighter, slower, but the march clung to me. Sometimes, even now, I wonder if the march is less a memory and more a companion, a part of yesterday that refuses to be dismissed. It does not always feel heavy. There are nights when I rise in the dark, my joints aching, and I hear the faint rhythm in my head, steady and sure, and it comforts me. It reminds me that I was not alone then, and I am not alone now. Not completely. Yesterday walks beside me, steps in time with mine. But there are other nights when the rhythm grows louder, insistent, filling the quiet of the room until I feel as though the floor itself will give way. In those moments, I remember the faces of the men who fell during the march. The ones who stumbled from exhaustion, who collapsed from hunger or fever, whose boots were left behind on the road. The march did not wait for them, swallowed them, then carried on. That truth presses on me like a weight I cannot shake. I recall one evening in particular. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised colors, and our column moved slowly along a road carved between two hills. A man beside me, Samuel. His name was fell without a sound. One moment he was there, the next his body crumpled like a sack. We looked at him, we looked at each other, and then we marched on. Orders did not allow us to stop. I have carried that moment ever since. Not the battlefields, not the noise of gunfire, but the quiet collapse of one man on a road too long to measure. When I sit in my chair by the window, I sometimes close my eyes and see that road again. I imagine what it would have been to stop, to lift him, to carry him with us. But the march did not bend to compassion. It was a river, and we were its current. To resist it was to be swept under, and yet, within that relentless motion, there were small mercies. A canteen passed from one hand to another. A shoulder offered when knees trembled. A song hummed under the breath, too soft for the officers to hear, but strong enough to remind us we were still men, not machines. These mercies were fleeting, but they stitched themselves into my memory as tightly as the sorrows did. When I walk now, slow, uneven steps through my quiet home, I sometimes try to mimic those small mercies. Pour a cup of tea and set it gently beside the empty chair across from me, as though offering it to a comrade. I place a blanket across my lap and imagine it as a borrowed cloak from a friend on a frozen road. The march still continues, but I try to soften its rhythm with kindness. Children in the village sometimes ask me why I limp. I tell them it is because one leg has marched farther than the other. Okay? They laugh, and I laugh too, though there is truth in it. My body remembers distances it cannot measure. Tonight, as I sit here, the rhythm returns once more. It's not loud, not painful, but steady, like a heart that refuses to still. I let it move through me, let it carry me back to those endless roads, and for a moment I feel less alone. For though many have gone, though yesterday weighs heavy, the march reminds me that once, for a time, I walked in step with others, and in some strange way, perhaps I still do. Letters that traveled slower than bullets. If there is one thing that defined the rhythm of our days more than the sound of shells or the hunger that gnawed at our bellies, it was the waiting for letters. In the trenches, in the makeshift camps, even on the march itself, we carried an invisible thread that tied us to someplace far away, a farmhouse, a street corner, a kitchen table where ink-stained hands wrote words they prayed would arrive. Bullets traveled faster than thought. They cut through the air, indifferent, arriving in an instant. But letters, those fragile messengers of love and life, they moved slower than seasons. By the time one reached us, its contents were already history. A baby born might already be walking. Okay? A promise of rain might have long since dried into dust. And yet, when the envelope was placed in our hands, quaint, as if it contained the future itself, I remembered the first letter I received at the front. My hands trembled so fiercely that I almost tore it open before I could break the seal properly. It was from my mother, her handwriting uneven, the ink smudged in places where I imagined her tears had fallen. She wrote of the garden, how the violets had bloomed early that year, how the old cat had taken to sleeping on my bed as if guarding it until I returned. She told me to eat well, though I had no choice in the matter, and to keep warm, though warmth was a luxury rarer than bread. I read that letter 100 times. Each word became a charm against despair. I folded it so carefully, tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat, and carried it with me until the paper thinned, until the edges frayed, until the ink faded into ghostly whispers. It was not the letter itself that sustained me, but the reminder that somewhere beyond mud and fear, life continued to bloom. Not all men were so lucky. Some waited weeks, months, even years without a single word. I recall one soldier, Martin, who never received a letter. He pretended he did, though. He would take a scrap of newspaper, fold it neatly, and slip it into his breast pocket. At night, he would take it out and stare at it as if reading invisible lines. When asked, he would smile faintly and say, "It's from home." None of us challenged his illusion. In war, mercy often took the shape of silence. Letters were not always comfort. Sometimes they carried sorrow sharper than any blade. I once saw a comrade collapse to his knees, clutching a page that told him his wife had died in childbirth. Kay read the lines again and again, as if repetition could alter the meaning. Kay held on to that letter until it turned brittle in the rain, until the ink dissolved into nothing. And yet he kept it, because to throw it away would have been to admit the finality of loss. I too received letters that wounded. A friend back home wrote to tell me that my childhood companion had enlisted in another regiment and fallen in his first battle. The words were plain, almost cold in their brevity. He died quickly, the letter said, as though speed lessened sorrow. I remember folding that letter and placing it beside my mother's. Side by side, love and grief traveled with me, pressing against my chest with every step. The strange thing about those letters was how they bent time. A single envelope could pull me backward into childhood, forward into a future I longed for, and at the same time root me firmly in the mud of the present. I would sit in the trench, rats scurrying around, the stench of damp earth rising, and yet I could almost smell my mother's violets, hear the creak of the wooden stairs at home, feel the warmth of a kitchen fire. For a few moments, yesterday and today sat quietly together, bound by ink and paper. I wrote letters to hundreds, perhaps thousands. Some were never sent. The censors cut away words deemed dangerous, leaving gaps that looked like wounds across the page. I learned to write in codes of affection, mentioning the weather when I meant I was still alive, describing the stars when I longed for hope. I wonder now how many of those letters survived, how many were lost in transit, how many were read and cherished, and how many were left unopened in drawers after the news of my survival or death reached home. There was one letter I wrote but never posted. It was addressed to a girl I had once admired from afar. I poured into it all the tenderness I never spoke aloud. How I remembered her laughter. How I wondered if she still braided her hair in the mornings. How I imagined her safe in the town square as bells rang. When I finished, I folded it carefully and placed it in my pack, but I could never bring myself to send it. Perhaps I feared rejection. Perhaps I feared that by sending it, I would invite fate to take her from me. That letter remains with me still, buried in a box of old things, unread by anyone but me. The waiting for letters was its own kind of war. Each day we asked if the post had come. Each day we measured our worth by whether our names were called. To receive nothing was to feel forgotten, erased, as though the world beyond had already buried us. Men grew bitter, jealous of those whose pockets filled with paper and words. Friendships frayed under the weight of envy. And yet, when a letter was received, the recipient often read it aloud, sharing its contents so others might feel touched by home too. I recall one winter evening when snow fell softly over the camp. A letter arrived for a man named Joseph. He read it aloud by the fire. It was from his little sister, who wrote about the Christmas tree they had decorated. It's the sweets they hoped to save for him, the prayers they said each night for his safe return. As he read, the entire group fell silent, listening as though her small voice traveled across the frozen fields to reach us. For a moment, we were no longer soldiers. We were brothers, sons, children ourselves. That letter warmed us more than the fire did. Even now, I keep a small box beside my bed. Inside are the letters that survived the years. Some are stained with mud, others with tears. Some are nothing but fragments of sentences that escaped the censor's blade. I take them out on nights when sleep will not come. Scream. I unfold them slowly, as though the paper might crumble in my hands, and I read the words again, letting them carry me back to the young man I was. Yesterday leans against me as I read, and today listens in silence. Bullets may travel faster than letters, but letters outlive bullets. The wounds of war heal into scars, the guns rust, the uniforms decay, but words endure. They carry voices across time, binding the dead to the living, yesterday to today. And when I close my eyes tonight, I know I will dream not of battles, but of ink flowing across paper, of envelopes sealed with trembling hands, of a soldier unfolding words in the dark and finding, if only for a moment, the strength to endure another day. The silence between shells. If the war had a voice, it was not the roar of the guns, nor the whistling descent of mortar, nor the cries that tore through the smoke. The true voice of war was silence to silence that came between shells. It was in those moments, brief and fragile, that we felt the weight of everything we were enduring. The shelling was unbearable, yes. The earth shook until it felt as though the world itself might split. Our ears rang, our teeth rattled, our bodies pressed into mud as though the soil could swallow us whole and spare us from the blast. But there was a strange kind of clarity in the noise. When the sky screamed, we did not have to think. We only had to survive the next second, the next breath. Then, without warning, the thunder would stop. And that silence, oh, that silence was worse than the barrage. I remember lying in the trench, heart pounding, mud dripping from the walls, and suddenly realizing that all sound had ceased. The guns had gone quiet, the air stilled. Even the birds, if there had been any, had fled long ago. In that emptiness, time expanded. A minute felt like an hour like eternity. We did not rejoice at the silence. We feared it, a tease, because we knew it was not peace. It was a pause, a held breath before the storm returned. Men gripped their rifles tighter in those silences. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly into the distance, their minds wandering to places far away. Kitchens filled with bread, lovers waiting at windows, fields golden with harvest. I too drifted. My thoughts returned to my father's garden, to the way the wind rustled through the apple trees at dusk. In that moment, the trench seemed unbearably small, unbearably fragile. A coffin waiting to be filled. The silence was heavy, not only because of what might come next, but because of what it revealed. When the gun ceased, we could hear other things: the drip of water into puddles, the scurrying of rats, the uneven breathing of the man beside us, the stifled sobs of someone trying not to be heard. Those sounds were too human, too raw. They reminded us that we were not machines, but fragile bodies breaking under the strain. There were times when the silence stretched longer than usual. Those were the worst. A shelling could be endured because it was predictable. Noise, chaos, fear. But when silence lingered, uncertainty grew unbearable. Was the enemy preparing an attack? Were we forgotten, abandoned to our own despair? Or worse, had the world outside simply ceased to exist? I once asked a chaplain who visited our unit what he thought silence meant. He paused a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "Perhaps silence is God's way of reminding us He is still listening." I wanted to believe him, but in truth, silence felt less like listening and more like absence. The strangest thing is that even in silence, sound never truly left us. Our ears rang with echoes of blasts already finished. The body remembered vibrations that the earth had long since released. I could close my eyes and still see the flare of explosions imprinted on my eyelids, still feel the tremor in my bones. Silence was not truly silent. It was filled with ghosts of sound. Years later, sitting now in my quiet home, I sometimes hear that silence again. Not the guns, not the chaos, but the hollow emptiness that followed. I can be sitting at my table, spoon halfway to my lips, and suddenly the room feels too still, too fragile. The ticking of the clock grows unbearably loud, the air too thick. And I am back there, waiting in the pause between shells, unsure whether the next moment would bring life or death. But silence also held something else, something I did not recognize at the time. It held the possibility of survival. Every pause between shells was proof that we had made it one moment further. In that thin slice of quiet, we were alive. And sometimes, if one dared to lift his head just slightly above the trench wall, he could see the stars. I remember one night when the shelling stopped suddenly. The smoke cleared enough for us to glimpse the sky. The stars were cold and brilliant, scattered like shards of glass across the darkness. For a moment, none of us spoke. We simply looked upward, our faces streaked with mud and fear, and felt something larger than ourselves. The silence stretched, but in that silence, I did not feel terror. I felt awe. It was fleeting, gone the instant the next barrage began, but I have carried that memory ever since. Silence was paradoxical, both terror and solace, both absence and presence. It was the canvas upon which war painted its noise. Without silence, we might not have recognized the violence for what it was. Without silence, we might have believed chaos to be the natural order of things. In the years after, people often asked me what the war sounded like. They expected tales of gunfire, of screaming, of explosions. And I did speak of those things, but what I wanted to tell them, what I never truly could, was that the war sounded most like silence. Quote, silence heavy enough to break a man's mind. Silence fragile enough to remind him he was still alive. Now, in the twilight of my life, I sometimes welcome silence. In this chair, by the window, with the lantern glowing faintly and the street outside quiet, I let yesterday sit beside today. In peace, the silence no longer threatens. It soothes. It reminds me that noise is temporary, okay, but stillness endures. I think of those who never returned, whose last moments were lived in that silence between shells. I wonder if they too looked upward, if they too glimpsed the stars. Perhaps, in their final breath, they found the same fragile awe I did. I hope so tonight. As the world outside my window settles into stillness, I let the silence wash over me. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of rest. Yesterday sits quietly at my side, no longer heavy, no longer cruel, only present. And together we listen, not for shells, not for echoes, but for the soft beating of life continuing, moment by moment. In the space between sounds, the bread that was shared in the mud dot of all the memories I carry from those years, some arrive with the force of thunder explosions, cries, orders shouted over the roar of chaos. But others come softly, almost tenderly, like the scent of bread rising in a distant kitchen. Strange, perhaps, that in a war defined by destruction, some of my clearest memories are of bread. Not feasts, not abundance, no, there was never that, but of crumbs passed from one hand to another, of crusts softened in muddy water, of a single loaf divided among many. Bread was never just bread. Hope, communion, okay, in the mud of the trenches, it was proof that humanity had not yet starved within us. I remember one evening after a day of shelling that seemed endless. We had been ordered to hold our ground, though the rain had turned everything into a swamp of filth and despair. Our uniforms clung to us, soaked through, and our hands were raw from scraping mud away from the dugouts. When rations were finally distributed, the bread was already wet, its crust sagging, its center heavy and sticky. Many might have thrown such bread away in peacetime, but there, in that place, it was treasure. I sat with two comrades, Joseph and Thomason, a plank barely holding above the muck. We each had a piece no larger than a fist. Without speaking, Joseph tore his portion in half and handed the larger piece to Thomas. Thomas protested, but Joseph only smiled faintly and said, "You'll need it more. You snore the loudest." We laughed weakly, and the laughter warmed us more than the bread itself. That moment stays with me still. Not because the bread filled my stomach hit hardly, but because it reminded me that generosity can exist even where everything else has been stripped away. Yesterday, sitting beside me tonight, still carries the taste of that soggy bread. Still reminds me that kindness is nourishment too. Bread connected us to home. Each crust was a link to kitchens where flour dusted the air, 2 hands kneading dough with care, 2 ovens glowing with warmth. We imagined mothers and wives rising before dawn to bake, imagined the crackle of crust as loaves were pulled fresh from the fire. To eat bread in the mud was to borrow a little of that comfort. To remind ourselves that beyond the trenches, life still held rituals of care. There was a soldier in my company, Emile, whose family owned a bakery. He spoke often of bread, describing the way the dough felt beneath his palms, the smell that filled the street each morning, the faces of customers lined up with baskets in hand. We teased him, of course, accused him of tormenting us with fantasies, but we also listened hungrily to every detail. In his words, we could almost taste sweetness, almost believe we were sitting at his family's table instead of knee-deep in mud. One winter, when rations dwindled and hunger gnawed more fiercely than fear, Emile managed to save half of his bread for 3 days. On the 4th, he gathered a group of us in the dugout and produced the hardened loaf. With a pocket knife, he carved it into the thinnest of slices, offering each man a piece so small it barely touched the tongue. But as we ate, Emile whispered the Lord's Prayer, his voice low and steady. For that moment, the dugout became a chapel, and the bread became something more than food. It became sacrament. I have never forgotten that. Even now, when I sit at my modest table and tear bread into a bowl of soup, I pause. I remember Emile's voice, the thin slices passed from hand to hand, the way hunger turned to reverence. Yesterday leans close in those moments, reminding me that the simplest act, sharing what little we have, can transform spare into something holy. Not all memories of bread are noble. There were times when hunger drove men to desperation, when fights broke out over rations, when a crust of bread became a prize worth bleeding for. I saw friendships fracture, saw men curse one another over crumbs. War strips away the thin layers of civility, exposing both the best and the worst within us. But even in those moments, I tried to remember the evenings when generosity prevailed, when laughter softened the edge of hunger. One night, after a long march, we stopped in a ruined village. The houses were hollowed by fire, their roofs collapsed, their windows gaping like wounds. In the remains of one kitchen, we found a single loaf of bread untouched on the shelf. Hard as stone, blackened at the edges, it looked almost inedible. Yet we carried it back to our camp, broke it with our knives, and softened it in broth made from turnips and roots. As we ate, we did not speak of ruin. We spoke of home, of dinners we once knew, of mornings when the smell of baking bread filled entire streets. That loaf, rescued from ashes, tasted sweeter than any feast. I keep a piece of bread on my table sometimes, not to eat, but to remember. The crust hardens, the inside turns to dust, yet I let it remain. It reminds me of those nights in the trenches, of laughter in the mud, of prayers whispered in hunger. It reminds me that even when everything else was stripped away, bread remains symbol of endurance, of life continuing, of yesterday sitting quietly beside today. Years after the war, I visited Emile's bakery. He had survived, though thinner, older than his years. His hands shook slightly as he kneaded the dough, but his eyes still shone when he spoke of bread. He gave me a loaf, fresh from the oven, its crust golden, its center steaming. When I tore it open, the smell filled me with a warmth I had not felt in decades. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, and with each mouthful, memories rose like steam. The dugout, the prayer, the thin slices passed among starving men. Emile said, "Bread saved us as much as bullets killed us." I nodded, unable to speak, because I knew he was right. Tonight, as I sit in my chair by the window, I place a small loaf beside me. I break it in half and set one piece on the empty chair. It is a gesture, nothing more, but it comforts me. It's yesterday. Shares the meal silently, and I do not feel alone. The bread may no longer be warm. The mud may no longer cling to my boots, but the memory remains. The act of sharing remains. And in that act, I find peace enough to close my eyes. Faces by the firelight. There were nights when the war quieted just enough for us to gather around small fires. Not great bonfires, those would have drawn attention. And attention meant death, but tiny flames, coaxed from damp wood and guarded with care. The fire was never large, but it was enough. Enough to warm our fingers, enough to boil a tin of water, enough to remind us we were still human in a place designed to strip humanity away. What stays with me most from those nights are not the flames themselves, but the faces they revealed. In daylight, faces were masked stiff with dirt, set in lines of discipline, hardened against fear. But in firelight, something changed. Shadows softened cheekbones, eyes glowed with hidden warmth, and for a moment, the boys we had been shown, through the men we were forced to become. I remember Thomas leaning close to the flames, his cap pushed back, his lips moving silently as though reciting prayers. He rarely spoke of faith during the day, but at night, by the fire, I could see his lips forming words older than war. His eyes reflected the fire's dance, and in that light, he looked less like a soldier and more like a pilgrim. Joseph, on the other hand, always laughed by the fire. He would tell stories, some true, most, not about the village girls who had promised to wait for him, about the trouble he used to cause at the tavern, about a dog that once followed him all the way to school. We knew he exaggerated, but we let him. His laughter rippled through us, brighter than the flames, warming us in ways fire never could. And then there was Emil, whose hands knew bread better than rifles. By firelight, he would mime kneading dough, telling us how to fold, press, and wait for the rise. His voice was soft, steady, hypnotic, and as he spoke, we imagined the smell of baking bread filling the trench. It was as if his words carried their own heat, their own nourishment. The firelight turned us into storytellers, philosophers, dreamers. In the mud of daylight, survival consumed us. But at night, when the flames flickered, we allowed ourselves to remember who we had been and who we might be again. Sometimes songs rose quietly from the circle. Not marching songs, those belonged to the day, to discipline and endurance. These were lullabies remembered from mothers, folk tunes carried from villages, hymns sung half forgotten. The firelight made us children again, leaning close, letting the melody cradle us. I can still hear one voice deep, trembling singing of a river winding homeward, carrying boats back to safe harbors. We closed our eyes and let that river carry us too, if only for a moment. Yet the firelight also revealed what the daylight tried to hide. The lines of exhaustion etched into young faces, the hollow cheeks of hunger, the eyes that no longer shone with innocence. I once caught sight of my reflection in another man's gaze, lit by fire, and barely recognized myself. The boy who had marched out in Chris' uniform was gone. Ella's place was a stranger, with shadows under his eyes and mud embedded in every crease of his skin. The fire made no judgments. It illuminated truth without cruelty. In its glow, we could see one another clearly, and that seeing bound us together. We were not alone in our suffering. We carried it as a shared burden, passed around like the tin cup of weak coffee brewed over the flames. There was one night, bitterly cold, when the fire nearly died. The wood was too wet, and our hands too numb to coax it further. As the flames dwindled, so too did our voices. Then, one of the men, I cannot recall who, reached into his pack and produced a single scrap of paper, a letter, perhaps or a page torn from a book. Without hesitation, he fed it to the fire. The flames leapt higher, casting light once more on our faces. No one asked what words had been sacrificed. We simply basked in the warmth, grateful for the small mercy. That night taught me something I carry even now. Sometimes survival requires letting go of what we most wish to keep. The words may have been precious, but the warmth saved us all. Yesterday whispers this truth often when I clutch too tightly at memory. When I close my eyes now, I see those faces by the fire as clearly as if they sit across from me in this quiet room. Their expressions flicker with the flames. Laughter, sorrow, longing, peace. Some of those men never lived to see another dawn. Yet in my mind, they are eternal, caught forever in that circle of light. Their voices low, their eyes reflecting warmth. I sometimes light a candle in the evenings. 'Tis small, nothing compared to those campfires, but its glow reminds me of those nights. I sit in my chair by the window, the candle flickering beside me, and I imagine the faces leaning close once more. Yesterday sits at my side, and together we keep vigil by the flame. The world outside may never understand what those fires meant. They were not merely warmth against cold. They were proof that even in darkness, light could be kind. They were reminders that we were still alive, still capable of laughter, still capable of remembering home. And when I drift into sleep, I sometimes dream not of battles, not of shells, but of firelight glowing against tired faces, of voices rising softly in song, of hands extended with bread or tin cups. In those dreams, yesterday and today sit together, side by side, warmed by the same flame. The night lanterns couldn't hide. The nights of war had their own kind of darkness. Not the peaceful dark of country fields where stars burn steady, nor the soft dark of childhood bedrooms where curtains swayed against a summer breeze. No, the darkness of war was heavy, oppressive, thick with smoke and dread. Yet in that endless night, lanterns flickered, fragile guardians against a world that refused to sleep. We carried lanterns not out of luxury, but necessity. They guided us through trenches, across shattered fields, into dugouts carved like veins into the earth. But their light was never safe. A lantern betrayed you. A lantern revealed too much. Strike a match and lift the flame was to risk being seen, being targeted. Still, we did it, 'cause without that frail light, the night would have swallowed us whole. I remember the glow of lanterns swinging on posts, their halos trembling in the wind. The mud glistened under their weak fire. Shadows stretched long and monstrous across the walls. Faces appeared suddenly, then vanished again, as if the light itself doubted their existence. We whispered under lanterns, our voices low, our eyes darting to the edges where darkness pressed close. One night, I saw Thomas sitting beneath a lantern, his hands trembling as he tried to write a letter. The paper shook, the ink blotting into dark stains, his face caught half in light, half in shadow. He looked older than his years, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes hollow. The lantern did not soften him, it exposed him. It showed the cracks, the daylight masked with discipline. Another time, I caught my own reflection in a lantern's glass. For a moment, I thought it was someone else, a stranger, gaunt and pale, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his lips pressed tight against words unspoken. I turned away quickly, ashamed of what I had become. Yet the image lingered, haunting me more than gunfire ever could. Lanterns revealed more than faces. Day revealed the fragility of our shelters. The flickering glow illuminated the thin boards, holding back mud, the frayed ropes, the seams of our coats unraveling. In daylight, we pretended those things were strong enough. By lanternlight, we saw the truth they were barely holding. We were barely holding, but lanterns also carried comfort. In their glow, we told stories, shared bits of bread, passed canteens hand to hand. The light, however dangerous, created a circle where we could pretend we were safe, if only for an hour. I remember Joseph lifting a lantern high once, pretending it was a ballroom chandelier. He bowed clumsily, offered his arm to an invisible partner, and danced in the mud. We laughed until tears streaked our cheeks, the lantern swaying with his movements, its light shaking like laughter itself. Yet no lantern could ever hide the truth of war. They could not conceal the fear in our eyes, nor the bodies carried back under canvas. They could not disguise the tremor in a man's hand as he reached for his rifle. If anything, lanterns stripped away illusions. They made visible what darkness mercifully blurred. There was one night, colder than most, when I followed the glow of a lantern to the medical tent. Inside, the air smelled of iron and damp cloth. The lantern cast a pale circle over a stretcher where a boy lay, no older than 16. His face was calm, almost peaceful, but the sheet beneath him was dark with blood. The lantern revealed him too clearly, too cruelly. I wanted to smash it, to plunge the room into darkness so I would not have to see. But the doctors needed the light. They could not work in shadows. So the lantern burned, and I stood there, watching, helpless. Years later, when I light a lamp in my home, I sometimes flinch. The gentle glow on my table reminds me of those lanterns swinging in the night. They still carry the double truth, comfort and exposure, warmth and cruelty. Yesterday leans close when I strike a match, whispering that light is never simple. But I do not fear lanterns anymore. I have learned that their weakness is also their strength. They do not banish darkness. They do not erase fear. They only push it back a little, enough for us to see one another, enough for us to keep moving. Perhaps that is all light is ever meant to do. Tonight, as I sit by my window, I keep a small lantern lit beside me. Its glow is faint, but it reaches across the room, touching the empty chair where yesterday sits. I see its reflection in the glass, and I wonder, what truths does it reveal about me now? My hands are lined with age, my eyes tired, my shoulders bent. The lantern shows me as I am, without disguise, and strangely, I welcome it. For if yesterday cannot be hidden, then perhaps it can be shared. The boots that outlived the men, of all the objects that remained after the war. None haunt me quite like the boots. Rifles rusted, uniforms rotted, medals tarnished, but boots endured. Thick leather, worn soles, laces frayed, yet holding boots, seemed determined to carry on even when their owners no longer could. I remember walking along a road after a retreat. The earth was littered with boots. Some stood upright, as though still worn by invisible men. Others lay toppled, half buried in mud, their tongues lolling out like tired mouths. It was a grotesque parade, boots marching on without bodies, carrying absence instead of flesh. We wore our boots until they nearly dissolved. Holes grew in the soles, letting in water and stones, rubbing our feet raw. Still, we tied the laces each morning because to walk barefoot was impossible. Our boots were our last defense against a world determined to break us. A man without boots was a man already half dead. I recall one comrade, Samuel, whose boots had split at the seams. He tried to bind them with wire, with scraps of cloth, even with string cut from his pack, but they would not hold. He limped badly, his feet bleeding, yet he refused to fall behind. One evening, another soldier, Joseph, always generous, took off his own boots and traded them for Samuel's broken pair. Joseph marched barefoot through frozen mud that night. He said nothing of his pain, but we all saw it in the tight set of his jaw. The next day, Joseph collapsed from frostbite. His feet were ruined, but Samuel survived because of that sacrifice. I often think of those boots passed from one man to another, carrying life and death in their worn leather. Boots outlived many of us. After battles, after retreats, after charges that left fields strewn with bodies, boots often remained. I saw them sticking out of shallow graves, emerging from the earth like stubborn roots. I saw them lined in rows outside field hospitals, stripped from the wounded to be reused. Death claimed the men, but the army claimed the boots back, as though leather mattered more than flesh. Years later, I cannot walk past a cobbler's shop without remembering the smell of leather, the sound of hammers striking nails. It carries me back to muddy fields and lifeless feet. Shoes are ordinary things for most people. For me, they are relics. In my attic, there is a pair of boots I kept. Not mine those, dissolved long ago, but boots I found abandoned after the armistice. They were small, too small for me, perhaps belonging to a boy who should never have been sent to war. The soles are worn thin, the leather cracked, but they remain. I keep them not as trophies, but as witnesses. They remind me of all the steps taken, all the miles marched, all the lives lost along the way. Sometimes I bring those boots down and place them beside my chair. Yesterday sits in them, invisible but heavy. I imagined the boy who wore them, imagined his laughter, his fear, his final breath. The boots tell his story when no one else can die. Boots were more than tools. They were symbols, made to measure distance, endurance, sacrifice. Each step we took wore them thinner, just as each day wore us thinner. And yet, like us, they held on far longer than they should have. I remember polishing my boots before my first march. The leather gleamed, my reflection faintly visible in the shine. I felt proud, almost invincible. By the end of the war, my boots were nothing but rags bound to my feet, my pride dissolved in mud and blood. That transformation mirrored our ennui, began as polished boys and ended as broken men barely held together, once in a ruined village. I saw a child wearing boots far too large for him. Ha! They flapped with each step, his feet sliding inside, but he wore them proudly. Perhaps they had belonged to a fallen soldier. Perhaps they were all he had. He smiled shyly at us as we passed, clutching a crust of bread in one hand. That image, boots carrying a child instead of a soldier, stayed with me. It was hope, fragile and strange, but hope nonetheless. Even now, when I take off my shoes at night, I pause. I place them neatly beside my chair, as though honoring a ritual. I remember the men who never had the chance to remove their boots again, the ones buried with laces still tied. It feels wrong to treat shoes carelessly, to kick them aside. Kay carried us. They bore witness. Some say ghosts walk in the places we fought. I believe that too, okay? But I think some ghosts walk in boots left behind, boots that never stopped marching, boots that carry the silence of men whose voices are gone. Tonight, as I sit by the window, I imagine those boots lining the street outside, row upon row, empty yet full of memory. They do not frighten me. That reminders that we walked, we endured, we lived. Yesterday wears those boots still, pacing quietly beside today. And when my own shoes finally rest for the last time, I hope someone will place them neatly, not as objects discarded, but as horror is remembered most for its noise, the thunder of shells, the sharp crack of rifles, the cries that tore through the night. Yet what lingers most in my memory is a gentler sound, the murmur of rivers that flowed quietly alongside our suffering. There were rivers that cut across our marches, rivers that ran past the trenches, streams that trickled through ruined villages. They were never mighty oceans, never heroic torrents. They were simple waters, moving steadily, indifferent to battles raging on their banks. And in their constancy, they became something sacred. I remember one river in particular. We had been marching for days, our throats dry, our bodies aching. When we reached it, we knelt as one, pressing our faces to the surface, drinking greedily, letting the water wash mud from our lips. The current was cool, cleansing, almost merciful. Some of us splashed it over our heads, laughing like children. For a moment, the war receded, drowned by the river's song. Water gave us more than drink. It gave us reflection. I recall leaning over a pool one night and seeing my face ripple beneath the stars. The water did not lines, showed me the gaunt lines of my cheeks, the hollow beneath my eyes, the boy I had been dissolving into a stranger. Yet, even that truth comforted me. For in water, faces changed and shifted, reminding me that nothing was fixed, not even despair. And there were the songs. It may seem strange, but men sang most often by rivers. Perhaps it was because the sound carried differently, softened by the current, woven into the murmur. We would sit on the banks, boots off, feet dangling into the water, and someone would begin a tune low, hesitant, almost shy. Another would join, then another, until voices rose together, blending with the river's endless hymn. The songs were never battle songs. They were lullabies, hymns, folk tunes, melodies of home. One man sang of a vineyard on a distant hillside, another of a mother waiting at a gate, another of a lover whose scarf still held her scent. Our voices cracked, stumbled, sometimes fell silent with tears, but the river carried them all, smoothing rough edges, carrying fragments downstream where perhaps no one listened, but perhaps someone did. I like to imagine those songs traveling farther than we ever could, flowing through valleys, beneath bridges, into villages untouched by war. Perhaps a child dipping her toes in the current one morning heard a faint echo of our voices. Perhaps an old man fishing on the bank felt something stir in his chest without knowing why. The river was our messenger, carrying our humanity into places we could not reach. There was one night I will never forget. The moon hung low, silver, on the surface of the water, and our unit had stopped for rest. Someone began a hymn sod, trembling. One by one, we joined. The river mirrored the moonlight, and our voices seemed to float upon it, fragile but enduring. Even the officers did not hush us. They stood still, listening, their own eyes reflecting the glow. In that moment, we were not soldiers. We were simply men, broken but still singing. I have often wondered since if God heard us more clearly by the river. Churches had been bombed, altars shattered, prayers drowned by noise. But the river untouched, eternal seemed a truer cathedral. Its current was the organ, its stones, the pews, its sky, the vaulted ceiling. Our songs rose from its banks like incense, carried away on waters that knew no borders, no sides, no enmities. Of course, rivers also bore witness to darker things. They carried bodies, sometimes our own, sometimes the enemy's, sometimes civilians, caught between. I saw children laid upon planks floating downstream, their eyes closed as though asleep. I saw helmets bobbing like grotesque buoys. I cannot pretend the rivers were innocent. They bore the weight of our sins as much as our songs. But even then, I could not hate them. They flowed as they always had, unbroken, unchanged. They did not choose what they carried, and perhaps that was their mercy, to hold both death and life without judgment. Years later, I still seek rivers. When my heart grows heavy, I walk to the stream beyond the village. I sit on its bank, listening. Sometimes I hum the old songs, letting the current carry them again. I like to think they mingle with the voices of my comrades, still flowing somewhere, eternal in water's memory. Last spring, I dipped my hands into the stream and felt its chill seep into my bones. For a moment, I was back there, boots off, mud on my skin, laughter rising around me. Yesterday, leaned close, whispering that we had not been forgotten. not while the river still carried our voices. Tonight, as I sit in my chair by the window, I close my eyes and hear it, the steady murmur of water moving over stones. I hear the hymns woven into it, the laughter, the tears. The river does not end, inly flows onward, and perhaps when my own voice finally falls silent, the river will carry it too. A final song, soft and steady, borne away to mingle with all the others. The morning that refused to arrive, vessels of the miles I walked, the burdens I carried, the quiet I learned to embrace. The river that carried the songs. The war had many enemies, but none so cruel as the night that would not end. There were nights when dawn seemed trapped beyond the horizon, reluctant to show its face, as though the sun itself feared what it might reveal. We would sit in the mud, rifles clutched, tight eyes burning from exhaustion, and wait, always wait. But morning did not come, or perhaps it came so slowly that it felt like eternity. The darkness was not like any ordinary night. It was thick, suffocating, endless. The stars, when they appeared at all, seemed dim, their light smothered by smoke. Lanterns offered little comfort, their glow stretched only a few feet before surrendering to the black. Time dissolved, minutes bled into hours, hours into something unmeasurable. Our watches ticked on, but we did not believe them. We measured time by our breaths, by the tremor of our own hearts. I recall one such night vividly. The shelling had stopped at dusk, leaving us in uneasy quiet. We expected it to resume at any moment, but it did not. Instead, silence pressed down, heavier than the artillery ever had. We sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nothing, staring into the dark. Every creak, every rustle, every cough echoed too loudly. So we prayed for dawn, not for victory, not for relief, but simply for light. Light meant proof that the world was still turning, that we had not been abandoned in some endless void. But the sky refused to pale. The hours stretched. Men began to mutter that perhaps morning would never come again, that we were trapped in a night without end. Some laughed bitterly, others shivered, others closed their eyes and prayed. I did none of these. I simply stared upward, trying to will the stars brighter, trying to imagine the slow crawl of light. It struck me then that morning is not a right, but a gift. At home, we never doubted it. The sun rose, the rooster crowed, the village stirred. It was as sure as breathing. But in war, even the sun seemed uncertain, hesitant to bless us with its return. When dawn finally did break, it came like a faint bruise along the horizon pale, reluctant. The light revealed us as we were, mud-caked, hollow-eyed, trembling. It revealed the trenches scarred deeper, the fields littered with debris, the faces of men who had aged years in a single night. Yet, for all its cruelty, that light was salvation. We blinked against it, our eyes watering, and though it showed us everything we wished to forget, we welcomed it like a brother. That was not the only night morning refused to arrive. There were many. As time had happened, we grew more convinced that the earth itself was weary of us, unwilling to turn. Each time, we realized anew how fragile hope can be when measured only in minutes of light. Some men learned to trick the darkness. They spoke of their wives, their children, their farms. They told jokes, often crude, but we laughed anyway, grateful for any sound that reminded us of life. Others sang softly, lullabies meant for infants, but sung by men who had seen too much. I remember Emil humming a tune about spring rain. His voice was thin but steady, and for a moment I could almost smell damp earth, almost feel blossoms opening. The night remained, but it felt less heavy. I wondered now if morning ever truly refused us, or if it was only our despair that made it seem so far away. Time is strange in war. It stretches, bends, fractures. A second under fire feels like a lifetime. A night in the trenches feels like forever. Perhaps the sun was moving all along, inching toward us while we sat blind to its patience. Years later, I sometimes wake before dawn. I sit in my chair by the window, watching for the first hint of light. The silence is familiar, the waiting familiar. Yesterday leans close, whispering of those endless nights. And when the horizon finally softens, when the sky turns from black to gray to pale blue, I feel relief as deep as I did then. The war has ended, but the gratitude for morning never has. There is something holy about sunrise, not because it promises joy, but because it promises continuation. Morning does not erase the night. It does not heal the wounds or rebuild the ruins. But it says, you have endured. It says, you are still here. I think of the men who did not see those mornings, the ones who closed their eyes in the dark and never opened them again. For them, the night truly never ended. I carry their absence each time the sun rises. Watch. The light spread and whispered their names into it, as though offering the dawn to them. Tonight, as I sit by the window, the sky outside is dark, but I know the morning will come, slowly, perhaps reluctantly, but it will come. And when it does, yesterday will sit beside today, both bathed in the same light, neither erased, both acknowledged. For that is the gift of morning, not that it ends the night, but that it allows yesterday and today to share the same sky. The medal buried with the uniform. When the war ended, some men came home with medals pinned to their chests. They shone brightly in the sun during parades, clinked softly as speeches praised courage, sacrifice, duty. But to those of us who had worn mud as our true uniform, the medals never seemed to carry the weight of what we had endured. T were bits of metal, polished and light, unable to hold the heaviness that still sat in our bones. I was given one, though I can hardly recall the exact citation. For bravery in action, the paper said. The ribbon was crimson, the medal itself round, etched with the symbol of our regiment. I remember standing stiff as an officer pinned it to my tunic, his words rehearsed, his eyes already moving on to the next man in line. I wanted to laugh, not because I felt proud, but because it seemed absurd that this small object could summarize the terror of holding a line while shells fell, quat, or the anguish of carrying a wounded comrade through mud that sucked, and my legs like quicksand. That medal followed me home. It rattled in a small wooden box tucked into a drawer with other remnants, dog tags, letters, a map stained with rain. I looked at it sometimes, but it never spoke to me. The faces of my comrades spoke louder. The silence of those who never returned spoke louder still. One day, I decided I could not keep it. It was too clean, too final, too proud for what it claimed to represent. I took it, along with the uniform I had worn on my last day of service, and I walked to the edge of the field where my father once planted wheat. The earth there was soft, the air still. I dug a hole with my hands, deep enough to hide both cloth and metal. I placed the uniform inside, folded neatly, though it no longer smelled of anything but dust, and I set the metal on top. Then I covered it all with soil. It was not an act of anger. It was not rejection. It was burial. The uniform and the medal belonged to yesterday, and yesterday was heavy enough without being displayed on my walls. I left them there beneath the earth to rest with the silence of the field. For years, I did not speak of this to anyone. When neighbors asked about my medal, I nodded vaguely, said it was somewhere safe. They assumed I meant a box, a drawer, a shelf. In truth, it lay beneath the ground, safe in a way they could not understand. Sometimes I wondered if I had done wrong. Medals are meant to honor, to remind the living of what was endured. But for me, the true honor lay not in metal, but in memory, in the bread shared in the mud, in the songs carried by rivers, in the faces lit by firelight. No metal could capture that dot. I think of Samuel, who fell beside me during a night assault. He was braver than I ever was, yet he received no medal, no speech. His name was written once in a ledger, then lost. If medals truly measured bravery, his would have covered the sky. Instead, the earth holds him unmarked but not forgotten. Perhaps that is why I buried mine. It felt wrong to display a symbol when others had only silence. By burying the medal, I returned it to the ground that held the rest of them. It was my way of leveling the balance, of refusing to let bright metal outshine flesh and bone. Years later, I passed by that field again. Wheat had grown tall, golden in the wind. I stood at its edge and wondered if the metal still lay beneath, if the uniform had turned to dust. I imagined the roots weaving through fabric, the ribbon fading into soil, the metal tarnished but intact. Perhaps the earth accepted them, keeps it holds them still as quiet testimony. In my home now, there are no medals on the walls. Visitors sometimes notice the absence. Other veterans keep theirs in frames, polished, admired. I do not begrudge them that. For some, the medal is a way to hold yesterday proudly beside today. For me, it is enough to hold it quietly in memory. When I sit by the window at night, I sometimes picture that small mound of earth where I buried the uniform. I imagine myself laying it down again, smoothing the soil over, whispering a prayer. Yesterday sits with me in that moment, not as a shining decoration, but as a shadow, as a presence, as a weight that needs no display. The truth is, the real medal is survival. The fact that I can sit here in this chair, breathing, remembering that, is honor enough. And the real ribbon is a thread that still binds me to those who did not come home. It stretches across time, invisible but unbroken. Tonight, as I close my eyes, I think not of the medal buried in the field, but of the men who rest in fields far from home. I think of the silence that covers them, of the songs rivers still carry, of the bread once shared in mud. These are the true honors, the true decorations. It's the ones no medal can ever equal. And so, yesterday sits quietly beside me, without need for shine, without need for ceremony, only presence, only truth. The walls that heard the prayers. The war was not fought only with rifles and shells. It was fought with whispers too, with words breathed into the dark when no one was listening, so we thought. Yet I believe now that the walls were listening, the walls of the dugouts, the bunkers, the cellars where we huddled during bombardments. Those walls heard everything. They absorbed our prayers like dampness, like smoke. They held them long after the voices had gone silent. I remember pressing my forehead against cold timber, my lips moving without sound. I did not know what words to use. I had grown up with prayers neatly recited in church, polished phrases carved by centuries. But there, in the mud, the only words that came were broken. Please, not yet. Please, let him live. Please, let me see morning. I do not know if God heard, but I know the walls did. Sometimes the walls seemed to echo faintly with voices of men who had prayed before us. In an abandoned shelter, I once traced my fingers across carvings etched into the planks, initials, dates, a crude cross. I realized then that another man, months or years earlier, had sat in that same corner, whispered his own words, left his mark. Perhaps he survived, perhaps not. But his prayer lingered in the grain of the wood, and when my lips brushed against it, it felt like we prayed together. Some men prayed loudly, their voices trembling, words rushing as if racing against the next shell. Others prayed silently, eyes closed, fingers clutching talismans, rosaries, scraps of cloth, coins from home. A few claimed they did not believe, but even they sometimes muttered to the walls when death pressed too close. In those moments, disbelief yielded to desperation. I recall one night when the bombardment lasted 4 hours. The wall shook, dust fell, the air grew thick. A young soldier, no more than 17, clutched my arm and begged me to pray for him. "I don't know how," he said, eyes wide with terror. I placed his hand against the wall, told him to speak whatever was in his heart. He did. His words were jumbled, frantic, but honest. And I swear, when he finished, the silence that followed felt softer, as if the walls had embraced his plea. Not all prayers were for survival. Some prayed for forgiveness, confessing sins in whispers too low for human ears. Others prayed for vengeance, voices sharp, fists clenched. Many prayed for home, not in grand phrases, but in simple words. Let me see my mother's face again. Let me taste bread at our table. Let me walk the street where I was born. These were the prayers the walls held most tenderly, I think. I prayed, too, not only for life, but for meaning. I asked why we marched, why we killed, why so many young lives were poured into the earth. The walls never answered, but they listened. And sometimes listening is enough. After the war, I returned once to a ruined bunker, long abandoned. Its walls were scarred, its roof half collapsed. Yet, when I stepped inside, I felt something stir in the air, a hush, a weight, a presence. I realized then that prayers do not vanish. They cling to places. The walls still held the echoes of our voices, layered like dust, timeless. Now, when I sit in my quiet room, the plaster walls around me seem plain, ordinary. Yet at night, when silence deepens, I sometimes imagine they listen to a whisper. Into them not pleas for survival now, but words of remembrance, names of men who never came home, fragments of songs, fragments of gratitude. Yesterday leans against the walls, nodding, reminding me that memory itself is a kind of prayer. People ask me if prayer works. I do not answer directly. For me, prayer was not about outcomes. Men died whether they prayed or not. Battles raged on regardless. But prayer gave shape to our fear, gave voice to our longing. It tethered us to something beyond ourselves, if only for a moment. And the walls received that tether, anchoring it when we could not. One night, long after the war, I dreamed of those walls. They stretched high, endless, covered in carvings of names, initials, prayers. Each mark glowed faintly, as though written in light instead of ink. I walked among them, tracing the lines, and everywhere I touched, I felt warmth. When I woke, tears dampened my face. It was not sadness alone, but something gentler like reunion. Perhaps heaven is not a place above the clouds. Perhaps heaven is simply the walls that heard our prayers, gathered them, and now keep them safe. Tonight, as I lean my head against the wall beside my chair, I whisper again, not please, let me live, but thank you, I did. And I believe the wall listens still, carrying my words into the same silence that once held all our fear, all our hope. Yesterday and today both press against the same walls now. Both whisper, both are heard, and that is enough. The watch that stopped at midnight, among the things I carried through the war. None seemed more ordinary and, yet, more extraordinary than a pocket watch. It was small, brass, with a cracked glass face. My father had given it to me on the day I left, pressing it into my palm as though handing me time itself. Keep it safe, he said. Let it remind you that time always moves forward, even when it feels it doesn't. For a while, it did. Each tick was a heartbeat I could hold in my hand. Each minute that passed was proof that I had survived one more. I would open it at night, its faint ticking steadying me when shells fell too close. I would check it in the morning when the frost clung to my boots, reminding me that the world still turned. The watch was not just an instrument, it was a companion. But then one night, In the midst of bombardment, the watch stopped. Midnight, exactly. The hands froze where they met, crossing like two swords. I did not notice at first. In the chaos, time meant nothing. But when silence came and I opened the watch, I saw it had abandoned me. Ticked no more. Midnight, forever. I felt betrayed. My father's words echoed. Time always moves forward. In my hand, it did not. It had chosen stillness. And in that moment, I wondered if perhaps time itself had abandoned us in the trenches that we were condemned to live in an eternal night. A midnight that would never end. I kept the watch anyway. I could not throw it away. It was useless as a tool, but it became something else, a symbol of survival. Each time I looked at it, frozen at midnight, I remembered that night we had endured. That moment when silence pressed heavier than any shell. The watch became a witness. Others noticed it. Joseph once laughed, saying, "At least you never have to be late again." Emil called it a relic. Thomas touched it reverently, whispering that maybe it had stopped because it had carried enough. Time for both of us, okay? Each man gave it meaning, as though trying to redeem its brokenness. Years later, I still have it. The brass has darkened, the crack across its face has deepened, but the hands remain at midnight. I have taken it to watchmakers. They shake their heads, say the mechanism is too damaged, too rusted. They offer to replace the parts, to make it tick again. I refuse, for if it ticked again, it would lose its truth. That watch does not measure hours anymore. It measures memory. It tells me not what time it is, but what time it was when the world seemed to end and then, somehow, continued. It tells me that midnight can last forever in one sense, and yet, in another, morning still comes. Sometimes, when I hold it, I think of Samuel, who died that same night. The watch stopped, and so did he. I cannot help but feel they are connected, as though the watch froze to mark his last breath, carrying it forever. Midnight became not just an hour, but a memorial dot in my home. The watch rests on a shelf beside my chair. When visitors see it, they sometimes ask why I keep a broken thing. I smile, though they do not understand. The watch may not tick, but it still tells a story. A story no living clock can tell. At night, when the house grows quiet, I take it in my hand. I trace the crack with my thumb, listen for the silence inside it. And strangely, that silence speaks louder than any ticking ever did. It reminds me that time is fragile, that life can pause without warning, that what we call forever may only be a breath. But it also reminds me that even broken things endure. Yesterday sits beside me when I hold it. Yesterday nods, saying, yes, midnight still matters. Today listens, knowing that even without ticking, the watch measures something deeper than seconds. It measures presence, it measures memory. Perhaps one day, after I am gone, someone will find it. They may wind it, shake it, frown at its stillness. They may be tempted to discard it, but I hope they keep it, not for its function, but for its truth. A watch that stopped at midnight, carried through war, carried through silence, carried into old age that is time enough, and so I let it rest. I do not demand its ticking. I let midnight remain, for in that frozen hour lives everything I cannot forget, everything I cannot fully explain, everything that still sits quietly beside me. Now, where the graves grow quieter than the living dot, there are places where silence is deeper than anywhere else. Not in the trenches, not in the pauses between shells, not in the long nights when morning refused to come. No, the deepest silence lives in the fields of graves. I have walked among them many times, rows upon rows of markers, some carved with names, others nameless, bearing only numbers or a simple cross. The grass grows evenly there, tended by careful hands, long after the war ended. Birds sometimes sing in those places, but even their songs seem hushed, softened by the weight of memory. It is as if the earth itself has learned to whisper. The first time I entered such a cemetery, I felt smaller than I ever had in battle. In war, fear swelled until it filled every corner of your chest. But there, among the graves, fear dissolved into humility. The air was too still, too sacred to allow fear. My steps slowed, my breath quieted. I removed my cap without thinking. It was not obedience to custom. It was instinct, reverence. What struck me most was not sorrow, but peace. The men lying there no longer carried hunger, exhaustion, terror. They no longer waited for dawn, no longer prayed to the walls, no longer clutched broken watches in trembling hands. Their suffering had ended. The silence of the living was heavy. The silence of the dead was gentle. I remember kneeling by one grave, its stone blank. I placed my hand on the cool surface and whispered a name, not one carved there, but one I carried in my memory. Samuel. I do not know if his body lay beneath that earth. Perhaps it was another man, another boy. But in that moment, the grave accepted my word, absorbed it, held it. The ground does not argue. It simply receives. Many times I have wondered why the graves feel quieter than the living. Perhaps it is because the dead no longer ask questions. They no longer demand explanations or cry out for meaning. They rest. It is we, the living, who make noise, our grief, our restless wandering. The graves simply keep, and yet they are not mute. If you listen closely, if you stand still enough, the graves speak in their own way, not in words, but in presence. They say, we were here, we mattered, do not forget us. The quiet is their language, and memory is its echo. I have seen mothers weep over those stones, their cries breaking the stillness. I have seen comrades salute, their hands trembling. I have seen children run between the rows, laughing, not yet understanding. Each time, the graves remained calm, patient. They did not resent the intrusion. They simply absorbed it, folded it into their silence. One spring, I visited a cemetery where wildflowers had sprung between the stones. Their colors brightened the ground, their fragrance sweetened the air. I thought then that the dead had not been forgotten, for the earth itself remembered them, dressing their resting places in beauty. The graves grew quieter still beneath the blossoms, as if peace had deepened. I keep no shrine in my house, no wall of medals, no framed photographs of comrades. But in my heart, I carry those fields. At night, when I cannot sleep, I walk them. In memory, I see the rows stretching into distance. I hear the wind brushing over the grass. I feel the silence settling like a blanket. Yesterday walks beside me there, calm at last, without weight. Sometimes I fear being forgotten when I, too, am gone. But then I think of those graves, of their quiet, forgotten or remembered. The silence will hold me too, and perhaps that is enough. Where yesterday sat quietly beside today, I sit now in the same chair by the window where this long conversation with myself has always begun. The cobblestones outside are still damp with evening rain. The crooked lantern still leans at the corner, and the night air carries the same hushed weight it did when I first returned home from the war. Decades have passed, but in this chair, time folds in on itself. Yesterday is never far. At first, I resisted its presence. I thought survival meant leaving the past behind, locking it away like a chest too heavy to carry. Kaya tried to silence the echoes, the marches, the rivers, the firelight, the cries. But silence does not erase memory. It only sharpens it. Yesterday sat beside me, whether I acknowledged it or not. Its shadow stretched across every day, reminding me that survival is not escape. Over the years, I learned not to push yesterday away, but to let it sit with me, not as an intruder, not as an enemy, but as a companion. I realized that today cannot stand on its own. It needs yesterday's weight to ground it, okay? And yesterday cannot rest until today gives it a seat. The objects around me prove this truth. The boots in the attic, the letters in the box, the broken watch at midnight, the candle flame flickering on the table, all of them are pieces of yesterday that I allowed to live quietly beside today. They do not demand, they do not shout. They simply remind me that who I am now is not separate from who I was then. Sometimes I wonder what my comrades would think if they could sit here with me. Would they laugh at the old man I had become, his back bent, his hair thin, his hands trembling as he lifts a cup of tea? Or would they simply nod, grateful that one of us carried the story forward? Perhaps both. There are nights when their faces return more clearly than others. I see Thomas praying by the fire, Joseph dancing with an imaginary partner, Emil whispering of bread, Samuel collapsing silently on the road. They sit in this room with me, filling the empty chairs. Their absence is a presence, their silence, a conversation. Yesterday gathers around me like an invisible company. Hey, and I am not alone. The world outside rarely asks about the war anymore. Children in the street know little of it. Their games are filled with laughter, unshadowed by memory. I do not begrudge them that. War should fade. Yet, inside me, it remains, not as fire, but as embers. Warm, glowing, sometimes painful, but also strangely comforting. I have come to believe that memory is not meant to be buried completely, nor displayed too proudly. It is meant to sit beside us, quietly, like an old friend who no longer needs to speak to be understood. Yesterday does not vanish. It waits, it listens, it shares the silence of today. Perhaps this is what peace truly is: not forgetting, not erasing, but allowing yesterday and today to sit together without conflict, to acknowledge loss without being consumed by it, to remember fear without living inside it, to let both sorrow and gratitude breathe the same air as I sit here tonight. The lantern glows faintly on the table, its light soft against the walls. Outside, the street is quiet, the world moving gently toward sleep. My eyes grow heavy, but I do not fear rest, for yesterday sits beside me, and today rests with it, and neither asks me to choose between them. If tomorrow comes, it will find me here, the same chair, the same window, the same quiet company. And if tomorrow does not come, then I will have already found enough, because in the end, the greatest gift is not that yesterday fades, but that it learns to sit quietly beside today, hand in hand, silence in silence, peace in peace.